Hi everyone, I'm Samira Ahmed, and I think there's a 5 second countdown, which I was going to try to do a whole masterpiece theater entrance, but I wasn't able to get that together. So I'm just taking these couple seconds to get to that countdown. And welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to be able to speak with you today. I want to thank Reading Group Choices for hosting me, and I wanted all to thank all of you for being here. I also just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge, obviously, this unprecedented and very difficult time that our country is in, and my hearts just go out to all of George Floyd's family and friends. And I think our country is really facing a kind of reckoning right now, and it's a time where we are asking a lot of difficult and necessary questions, and dialogue is an important first step to that. And I just wanted to speak for a second about that because obviously I am a writer, and though I don't think books are um, always the only way for people to, um, I don't think books have all the answers, but I do think they're an important starting point. And I apologize because I just think I was having a slight audio problem. But I hope it's fixed. If someone's on there and can tell me if they can definitely hear me okay, that would be great. But let me know if you can't hear me because I think I corrected it. So in any case, I apologize, but I for that little audio glitch. But I do think, like I said, that literature is an important starting point. I think books are an important place for us to meet each other. And I think um, literature is, and our stories are some of the greatest forms of interrelatedness we have. So before I get to talking about some of my books, and because I always forget to do this at the end, I wanted to share a few book suggestions with you at the beginning and let you know that I'm supporting and want to give a huge shout out to my local indie bookstore, 57th Street Books on the Seminary Co-op. They are sibling bookstores, and you can get any of these books there. The first one I'm going to recommend really quick is Felix Ever After by Case and Callender, a amazing story about a Black queer trans character, Felix, who is involved in kind of a catfishing scheme, the quest for self-identity, and falling in love. Another book that I recommend to everyone, especially if you like anthologies, for me right now during these sort of quarantine times, my focus hasn't been great, but anthologies have been getting me through on the reading front. And A Phoenix First Must Burn, edited by Patrice Caldwell, is a favorite. It's science fiction, fantasy, literal Black girl magic. And then one other quick book I wanted to recommend, The City We Became by the incredible N.K. Jemisin. It's where New York City literally comes to life. And I recommend all of those. So though I'm here today to speak to you about to speak to you about Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know, my latest novel. I'm also the author of Internment. That was my book that came out last year. And then Love, Hate, and Other Filters. Oops, there's that tilt, which came out prior to that. But Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know has really been a book that is almost decades in the making for me because it threads together various parts of my life in a way. So it speaks a little bit to I guess, to some themes that are also in the book, which is, sort of fate and destiny a little bit. But the seeds for this book were actually planted when I was a senior in college and was writing my bachelor's thesis, which I wrote, I have it here for you, which I wrote on romantic Orientalism. That was inspired by a class I took called Evidence Example Explanation, where we read Frankenstein and then read texts that would have influenced Mary Shelley. Percy Bysshe Shelley and Byron, but also her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, and her father and other writers at the time. And it was just really, I love that in-depth sort of look into a single text and how other texts that the author might have been reading influenced her writing. I love that intertextuality. So I wrote my bachelor's thesis also actually on romantic Orientalism because that was inspired by a single character in Frankenstein, the character of Safie. And She is a Muslim character in that book, and I was kind of surprised to find her there. And I was also curious about the portrayal because it definitely portrayed her in these very stereotypical ways, and I sort of wanted to unpack that a little bit. So that was my bachelor's thesis. I also worked in the archives at the university library, and one of the things that's interesting about that is that archival research plays an important role in Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know. And while I was working in the archives, I was tasked by the head archivist to find a single sheet of paper that had been lost for about 100 years and was the original faculty minutes, faculty handwritten minutes from the very first faculty meeting at the university 100 years prior. And so I love libraries at work, and I love research, and I love cross-referencing. So I actually was able to find that single sheet of paper that had been misfiled in an archive, and through sort of guesswork of where it might have been. So those things sort of came together. And also my love of this Byron poem, The Jower, that actually strongly influenced Eugene Delacroix, the painter, who then went on to paint a series of paintings um, based on that poem. And that character, the Jower, and Layla, who is one of my main characters, came from that poem. So that's a lot of backstory for this novel. But Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know is a dual POV novel with two young women whose stories sort of connect over time, somewhat unbeknownst to to the one woman, young woman in present day, Khayyam, who um, really loves art history and wants to be an art historian, but kind of flubs a chance of potentially getting into her dream school because she writes a disastrously researched essay. She thinks she's made this incredible discovery, a connection between Eugene Delacroix, the painter, and Alexander Dumas, the author of the Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo, etc. Dumas and Delacroix were friends, and there is some actual historical evidence that showed that Dumas might have owned this particular painting that Delacroix did of the Jower. So she thinks that she has discovered this incredible art secret, but then is cut down to size pretty immediately by an art historian who says if she had only researched a little further, she would have known that she's wrong. So she goes off to Paris for her summer vacation with her family. Her father is French, and they go there annually. And while she's there, sort of, nursing her wounds, she meets through various happenstance a young man who is also named Alexander Dumas and is the sixth great grandson of the writer Alexander Dumas. So that's the first POV character. And the second POV character, Layla, is a young woman who is inspired by Byron's poem and is a character in Byron's poem. The Jower is really an epic poem, over 1,000 lines long. And one thing that I found incredible about it is also a multiple POV poem, which is pretty unusual at the time. And it all ostensibly it evolves around Layla, this young harem girl who the Jower and the Pasha, she's in the harem of the Pasha, literally have a fight to the death over. So it's told from multiple points of view, except Layla never gets a line in the poem. She never gets a point of view. And part of what I wanted to do with this novel is give Layla her voice. And I do that through Khayyam, who in her interaction with Alexandre, they discover a line in a letter between Delacroix and Dumas about a mysterious woman who was living in Paris in the 19th century who might have been a muse in some ways to both of them. And they set off on kind of a scavenger hunt, a literary or a history mystery, as I sometimes like to call it, through Paris, through the archives of Paris, and through, just through old letters and paintings and museums to try and discover who this mysterious woman is. And as they're sort of going on this adventure, a lot of questions arise, which is why are women's stories buried in history? Why? What is the role of patriarchy in doing that? And who owns the rights to tell a story that has been buried? What are the sort of consequences of uncovering that kind of story and sharing it. And why is it important to do so, or what could potential repercussions of that be? So they're sort of involved in all of that, but also possibly falling in love. So I have a few different things going on in there, and I just wanted to read to you a tiny bit from both Khayyam's voice and also from Layla's voice. I had a lot of fun writing both of their stories, and I guess for me, writing Layla's was also great because I got to write in sort of a different voice, a voice of that time, the 19th century. The novel also contains letters that I wrote in the voices of Byron and Dumas and Delacroix, which is also a lot of fun because you get to be a little bit of a mimic. I enjoyed writing all of those voices. But now I'm going to just read to you a little bit from the first time we meet Khayyam, and then I'll read to you a little bit from the first time we meet Layla. Khayyam. I live in between spaces, the borders between nations, the invisible hyphen between worlds, the wide chasm between one of us and me alone. French American, Indian American, Muslim American. Biracial, interfaith, child of immigrants, a Parisienne for 1 month a year, the month when all other Parisians flee the city. A girl staring at her phone screen, looking for love, but knowing it's not going to show up. I didn't choose any of this, which is not to say I wouldn't have, given the opportunity. But it's not like I ever had the option. I don't even get a say in my diminutives. It's always Frenchy or Le Petit Américain. The people who can't guess what I am think I'm exotic. Some people say I'm lucky to be an ethnomorph, a person whose brown skin, brown hair, and brown eyes make it seem like I could be from half the countries in the world, but I'm not a passport that everyone gets to stamp with a label of their choosing. Others look at me and try to shove me into their own narrative to define who I am and what I am, but I'm not a blank page that everyone else gets to write on. I have my own voice. I have my own story. I have my own name. It's Khayyam. And now I'm just going to read just the very first time we are introduced to Layla. So this is Layla's first chapter. Haseki, the favored. That is what they are compelled to call me, all of them, eyes cast downward in reverence. Do not aspire to this, I want to warn the young ones, the ones whose rosy lips and cheeks have yet to be introduced to Pasha. But I do not say this. I say little, choosing my words wisely. This is how you survive. Study, rise through the ranks, become irreplaceable, become the chosen one. Find your power, use it, but softly. Haseki. Pasha conferred this once ancient title upon me to fashion me after Suleiman's most beloved and trusted Haseki. It is an honor, he told me, a gift. In that moment, my name was erased, buried under dirt, but my spirit was not. Anyway, so that is Layla's first chapter, and I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, but I can also, so you can type them in. I don't know if it's on your left side or right below, so you can go ahead and type in questions if you have, and I'd love to be able to answer them. But meanwhile, I'll also just talk a little bit about one of the questions I always get asked is how I approach the novel once I have an idea. And for me, I have kind of developed my own method, and that is usually to write a short story first. So anytime I have an idea that I think could be a novel, I usually write a short story first. It doesn't encapsulate the entire novel, but rather it takes the main character that I want to write about and develops a small story around them, and introducing little bits of that world. And that gives me a sense of whether the story has legs. Like, am I going to, do I want to live in this, this world for 70 or 80 or 90,000 words or however many it is? And for, the year or 2 years I spend in drafting that novel. And a lot of times that basically lets me see if the novel has legs. And in this case, with Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know, it's really my first time writing two POVs in that way. I did have, for my first novel, Love, Hate, and Other Filters, interstitial chapters. And But for this one, I actually wrote the entirety of Layla's story first as the short story. And then I was able to build Khayyam's story around that and sort of fit her parts of the story in there as sort of kind of puzzle pieces to go along. Because as Khayyam's story moves forward, we see little connections between um, Layla's past and Khayyam's present, and one speaks to the other in a sort of direct way. Um, so I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about why it's so important to you as a writer to create strong female characters? So I think it's interesting, this phrase strong female characters, um, because I think that I really believe that all women that I write are strong, even if they're not labeled quote unquote as strong, because I think to be a young woman in this time means that you have to be, or to really in any time. And I think there's sometimes also the notion that to be strong means that you can't be vulnerable. But for me, I think with all my characters, they have kind of a vulnerability to them. And that doesn't take away from the strength of who they are. In fact, I think it contributes to it, because strong characters can also be soft. So I think it's important for me to develop those characters because when I was teaching high school and even now with the young women I interact with, I just find it's so important to create these really three-dimensional, fully developed characters on the page. And what kind of feedback do you get from young readers? Uh, do they see themselves in the character? I love that question because a lot of times people ask me when was the first time I saw myself in a book, and that is a part of why I write my books, where all my main characters, my protagonists, are Indian American and Muslim. And when I was growing up, I never really saw any character, not a single one like that. The first time I really saw an Indian character that I could relate to in any way was when I was an adult, and it was in Jhumpa Lahiri's Interpreter of Maladies, a fantastic anthology of short stories, which I highly recommend. But a lot of times, I have not gotten to go on tour yet with Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know, so I haven't had an opportunity to meet readers because this came out during quarantine. But when I was on tour for Internment, which is this one of the things I really loved when I was especially visiting high schools about this book is how many different people could relate to the main character here. And it was all in different ways. So I love how people can find, tiny pieces of themselves in a character, even if the character doesn't exactly reflect their own life or their own life experience. So, for example, I had one young Muslim reader come up to me and tell me that she was actually very afraid to read Internment, but that when she read it, she felt so happy that someone had expressed her fears onto the page, but also had given her some hope. And I think that when you develop characters who are rounded and who have those fears and who have vulnerabilities, but who still try to see things through, who try to use their voice, who try to use their power and privilege for a perfect purpose, I think that really can empower young people when they're reading, or really any readers. I mean, I like to read those kinds of stories myself. And then at the same time, I had other young people who came up to me who were not Indian or not Muslim and were white, for example, and maybe couldn't relate in some ways to the character, but in other ways, they understood what it meant to try to find their voices, even when, they're facing sort of a world or a wall of no, where people are saying they can't achieve something or they can't have something, or where expectations are unfairly, cast upon them, and how hard it is and how much courage they have to find their voice and to sort of speak their own truth. So it's been really, I love meeting readers. So I hope I can do so again soon, but it's pretty amazing to meet young people who can relate to my characters in that way. Um, Let me see if I have any other questions right now. Um, I think that, one of the other questions I have for that I've gotten, with a bunch of my novels and also with more specifically with Mad Bad is how a lot of people are interested in sort of the drafting and the redrafting. And for me, I think that's a really interesting way to consider character development, which kind of relates to the other question, because I think every time I meet the characters on the page, is almost like another time, a first time, because I want them to have, come with their whole selves um, to the reader. And I think that's the way a reader can have a dialogue or be in dialogue with a novel or a text. Um, and that's to me is like one of my favorite parts of being a reader, but also being a writer. So I have this question here, which is, yes, I mentioned being a teacher. What do I miss about being in the classroom? So I taught high school English for 7 years, and many of my students are older now and are adults and have kids of their own and can read, who are reading my books, which is kind of a surreal experience. But at the same time, I do kind of miss the sort of energy of the classroom. I miss just being able to speak with young people, all the time. I think that's why when I finished a book and I know that I'm going to be able to visit schools or to be on tour and meet readers, why I love that part so much. I know that a lot of times people think that authors are very introverted, and I think we all do have a sense of, what it means to work in a solitary way. But I love being out there to meet teens and high school kids when I'm in high schools, and to meet readers in general. So that's something that I really, really love doing. And I kind of miss, I don't know how all of you guys are kind of managing with quarantine, but for me, I think that interaction is something that I've really been missing a lot. And I hope we can get back to that really soon. I think that, for me, during these times where we've been separate, it's also been such a reminder of how stories connect us. And that really goes back to a lot of themes in Mad Bad, because I think when you open, the cover of a book and look into those pages, it's almost like history reaching out towards you and taking your hand and pulling you into the story, which I think is, I don't know, it's kind of what makes literature magic. And I kind of think it's what makes, stories magic, because we've had stories, the idea of telling stories is like so much just a part of our DNA in a way. I think back to how, stories were put down on the page, and that to me is really inspiring. And when I was writing Mad Bad, I kept thinking of all these stories of women who we never get to hear, or we that have been buried, and how truly tragic that is, because it's so much genius that's just lost, and so much history that's been lost, because the victor gets to tell their stories, and when you're facing patriarchy, there's one clear victor. And I think when the movie Hidden Figures came out, that idea came into I think that idea came more to the forefront for a lot of people. I mean, it definitely did for me. Um, and so that I think was always in the back of my mind, these incredible accomplishments from women, and, Black women, women of color, especially, that we just never get to hear. And so I hope that we can continue to work on unburying those stories. I think it's so fascinating and so interesting. Okay, let me see if I've missed anything over here. Um, Sorry, my thing is flickering a little bit. I apologize for that. It looks like it stopped for a second. So another question that I often get asked, besides books that I recommend now, are, if I was always a reader and always a writer as a young person. And I always loved reading. I was really a reading kid, and but I wasn't always a writer. Um, I think I came to writing kind of late. I always enjoyed writing, but I always tell people that when I was a kid, and you know how people are always asking children, what do you want to be when you grow up? So my answers were always ballerina, tennis player, and doctor. And none of those actually came to fruition. I just really was not graceful enough to be a ballerina. Tennis, I played on my high school tennis team, but I honestly think that was just inspired by like having a crush on Bjorn Borg, and Um, and doctor was just not going to work out because I am scared of blood. It literally makes me faint. And so I think that I was someone who always believed that you could do different things in your life. And so when I was always kind of writing and always enjoying it. And it wasn't until, much later into my career, really into my second career when I was working in education nonprofits, that I started getting more serious about writing for fun, as kind of a hobby. And then I got sort of this idea in my mind of a young woman, facing discrimination and trying to sort of just be who she wants to be. And that story eventually became my first novel, Love, Hate, and Other Filters. And, I remember thinking, like, could I actually write a book at the time? I wasn't sure how exactly to write a book because I had never done one before. And I wasn't really in a writing circle. I didn't have an MFA. And so I just was thinking, well, it was a dream, a new dream that I had. And I always believe there's no expiration date on dreams. So I thought I might fail, but I still have to try. And so that is how I sort of came to be a writer. And that's a question that I get a lot. And I know I meet a lot of writers who knew at a very young age that writing was a passion for them. But I came to it kind of later. So if you have a dream of being a writer or something else that you're not sure if you can have a new dream in middle age, I strongly, strongly encourage it. I think we are coming down to sort of the last few minutes. So if there's any other questions, I will take a look. Um, no, it doesn't look like another question's popping up. So I just want to do um, another quick plug for 57th Street Books and the Seminary Co-op, which are the indie bookstores in my neighborhood. They are actually member owned, and besides having me as a member, one of their most famous members is Barack and Michelle Obama. So they are huge fans also. And for Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know, if you order it from 57th Street Books, they also have, I believe, are still have these like little pins, these Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know pins, which I really love, which they will send with your order. I believe they still have some of those. So I don't think we have any other questions. So, you know what? Actually, I do. Well, that just froze for me. Sorry. Um, Oh, I do have one more over here. Sorry, my panel froze on me for a second. A few of the characters you mentioned seem to be searching for a sense of belonging. Do you think that search happens more during teenage years? Is that part of why you focus on young adult characters and audience? Have I also written adult books? So I have not written adult books. I have a potential idea for an adult book, but that's just sort of brewing in the back of my brain. I think the thing that I do think a sense of belonging is something that characters search for regardless of age. I think that it's especially prominent for the young adult characters and for that age group. I always talk about writing for young adults as writing into the realm of possibility. And to me, that's a very hopeful place. I always think of it as, this moment where kids are really on the cusp of adulthood and they're facing like this wall of doors, and they can open whichever door they want. Now, some doors are probably going to be harder to open. Some doors are going to be easy to open. Some doors are going to open and they're going to be like, I don't want to go down that door. But I think one of the amazing things about that time in life is that you have a lot of choices and opportunities. And I love that sense of hope that goes with that. But it's also a time of difficulty and struggle and finding who you are and figuring out who you belong with, like who are your people. And I think both of those make just for such, it's just such interesting fodder for a story. And, I love both the conflicts that arise from that, but also just the sense of self that you get when you face some of those times, some of those struggles. So I think that is, I don't know, I love writing in that space. I think it's a hopeful space and an interesting space, and I love it. So I'm going to continue writing in that. I do have the next thing I'm working on is actually for younger kids, a middle grade fantasy, and then I have a couple more ideas for young adult. And like I said, I do have an adult story brewing in my brain, which also happens to be about a historical figure whose story has kind of been buried. I think there's like these themes. There's a few themes I think that run through all my novels. One is the story of sort of the revolutionary girl. And I think revolutions can sometimes be even quiet revolutions, which means to be able to be who you are and speak your truth. And for some people, that can be extremely revolutionary. I think that's an important theme. And I think another important theme in my novel is just, people, young people, and young women especially, um, being able to find themselves and find their voice. And like those stories of young people and young women who have done that through time, I think are very inspiring. So yeah, I think that's part of why I love writing for young adults. I think we are like sorry, my left side of my screen seems to be freezing. I'm not sure why that is happening, but I hope I got to most of the questions. Um, and if you have any more and want to pop one up real quick, I can do that. Otherwise, I just will send all of you my best wishes. I hope you're all safe and healthy and are taking care of yourselves. And thank you so much for being with me this evening.